Welcome to Building the Future. I'm your host, Kevin Horick. You can check out the radio version of the show every Tuesdays and Thursdays at 2 p.m. Eastern on WDJY 99.1 in Atlanta. We also air on a podcasting network in Los Angeles called the 405 Media. There's a TV version of the show that airs on KMVT 15 in Silicon Valley at 8 p.m. Pacific on Tuesday nights. Both versions of the show air in other states. For these show times, plus past episodes, please visit the show's website at buildingthefutureshow.com. The music for the show is done by Electric Mantra. You can check him out at electricmantra.com. Join me at the 10th Annual Media Excellence Awards on January 18th in Beverly Hills, California. The attendees and I will be celebrating innovation and leadership in technology and entertainment. There are 20 award categories with 1,000 nominees. These awards honor those who are creating groundbreaking technology to better our lives and celebrate the hard work, determination, and brilliance in the leadership within the companies which create the new world we live in today. I will be recording nominees and winners at the awards. For tickets and more information, go to MediaXAwards.com. Welcome back to the show. Today we have Louise Baigelman. She's the co-founder and executive director at Story Shares. Louise, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on the show. I think what you guys are doing at Story Shares is actually really interesting and much needed. But before we kind of get into that, let's get to know you a little bit better and kind of start off with where you grew up.
Sure, yeah. So I grew up in the Philadelphia area, right outside of Philadelphia.
Okay.
And
keep going, sorry.
Okay, yeah. I actually just moved back to the area, so I'm now where I began.
Sure.
And then I went to college in upstate New York.
Okay.
At Cornell.
What did you take there?
And then I was a English and psychology major.
Okay. And what got you, or why did you want to take English and kind of psychology? Was there like a defining moment in your kind of childhood or as you were growing up?
Yeah, I was always really into English and reading, writing. I always say, my parents turned all the walls in our house into bookshelves throughout my childhood. So it's always kind of surrounded by books. And that's what drew me to English. And then I'm also fascinated by people and what makes people work. And, the funny thing about English and psychology is that they're obviously different fields, but there's a lot of overlap as far as analysis of characters. So those were I also kind of had a sense that I wanted to go into education, but wasn't fully there yet. So those were the right kind of fields of study for me.
Sure. And then you did get your Master's of Education, correct?
I did, yes.
And so obviously what made you kind of decide to go, okay, I want to go and actually take education?
Yeah, so I've always been interested in education, particularly low-income populations. I actually went to a Quaker high school, and one of the things that they have as part of the framework there is that you go and do service projects throughout middle school, high school, built into the school day. And so that was kind of my first exposure. I worked at, I volunteered at a homeless shelter and tutored the kids there. And at that point, I remember being struck by this kind of contrast of, so close to where I lived and such a different reality for those living in poverty. And so at Cornell, I did most of my extracurriculars were also related to education and tutoring. I had the chance to, go into middle schools and work with students there. And so by kind of late college, I knew that was what I'd want to pursue. And I applied for Teach for America, which was a really perfect pathway into education, particularly with the low-income focus. And that definitely solidified it.
No, that's awesome. So when you finished your master's, you kind of you've done a bunch of stuff in the teaching space. You said you worked at Teach for America. But walk me through kind of your career up until you decided to co-found Story Shares.
Yeah. So I was a teacher. I was a middle school teacher in Lynn, Massachusetts, so just north of Boston.
Okay.
And I taught English language learners and students who struggled in general and focused on reading and writing.
Okay.
And actually, a lot of what drives the work I'm doing now with Story Shares came out of that experience, because it was there that I had, 12-year-olds reading at a first or second grade level, and I struggled to find the right books for them to actually engage them in reading. And so I was there for 2 years and then kind of bounced around. I actually moved to California for a year. I taught there as well, and then moved to New York, where I started working at a family foundation.
Okay.
And I was there for 3 years. And actually, Story Shares, we got to start as a project within that foundation.
Nice.
And that was how it ended up kind of being born.
That's great. So before we kind of get into Story Shares, you also do some writing for kind of understood.org. What types of stuff do you guys, types of stuff do you write for them, and what is the site kind of geared towards? Because I think it's a really good resource.
Yeah, Understood is a great resource. It's actually really new, but they've been able to put together so much content in a short amount of time. It's really focused on supporting parents of children with learning and attention issues, and helping to equip the parents with the tools and resources and community and understanding to, better support their own children in the journey of, struggling with learning. And my role there is around reading and writing issues. So I write articles, anything from how to hook your teenager into reading if they don't like it, or strategies for supporting students who struggle with writing. So I tend to focus on the reading and writing section of students who struggle with learning.
Sure. No, that's great. And that's understood.org, just so people can kind of check that out and go read your posts there. But I want to, you kind of mentioned it a few minutes ago that Story Shares came out of a foundation you were working at, but what exactly is it, and kind of walk us through kind of how it became kind of a real thing inside of an organization?
Yeah, so it's an atypical path, and it's but it was a cool way for it to be born. So basically, what we did at the foundation was we started it as kind of an experimental project, and we launched this initial writing contest. So the idea was, we knew like the problem identification part was there. I had experienced the problem, as I mentioned, from my own experience as a teacher. The foundation itself was focused on education, but also learning disabilities, and they were interested in this same issue. If you're an older student, if you're 15, but you're reading at the third grade level, you're never going to want to read books for third graders, but the books that are, written for your age group are too hard for you to access. And so we came up with this framework for writing contest as sort of a test to see if we gave guidelines and incentives to writers, would we be able to get them to actually create a new category of books that would meet the needs of these older students who are reading at lower levels. And so we planned and ran the contest within the foundation, and it was a huge success. We ended up with almost 600 story submissions in just 4 months.
Wow.
And so that was like a real proof. It kind of exceeded everyone's expectations and felt like a real proof point. And so at that point, we did a lot of follow-up research around the stories to make sure we knew, like, are these really what we were going for? Are they high quality? Will they help the students? And that was also, resoundingly positive. And so at that point, the foundation gave us a grant or seed funding to spin this out and turn it from this internal project into, an independent nonprofit organization to continue generating and then distributing these kinds of books.
That's great. I love that. And I think
Thank you.
One of the reasons I wanted to kind of have you on the show, outside of kind of promoting what you're doing kind of as a resource, is I think when we talked months ago, when you told me kind of you're working in a career and, you know, you're working at this foundation and you basically tried this project out and then kind of spun it into, in your case, like a not-for-profit. But I think like a lot of people that are kind of looking at being an entrepreneur or doing something, they're almost like scared to take something that's working inside of maybe their day job or foundation or something and actually make it into kind of its own entity, whether it's for profit or not for profit. And I think just your journey, just going through that, I think is, you know, inspiring to other people to actually do this stuff inside of whatever industry that they're in.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, definitely a leap.
Sure, but I
to
think
go
that's
from
good,
kind of
So
absolutely.
So you kind of gave a pretty good quick overview of Story Shares, but walk us through exactly kind of what you do. You mentioned obviously like you curate books for different age groups and stuff like that, but it's kind of more than that, correct?
Yeah, so yes, it is. It's a digital literacy hub. Is one of the ways we kind of talk about it.
Sure.
And the hub has kind of these two key components. The one is the writer side and the other is the reader side. And so the writer side, it's a digital writing platform that guides writers to create books that are at lower levels, but that are, you know, compelling to teenagers, that are culturally relevant for, you know, a diverse group of readers. So they use our book publishing tool to create these books and then submit them to our library. And then we curate that content, we edit it. The stuff that's high enough quality, we then include into our library. And so that's the reader side, which is, you know, this library is sorted by genre, but you can also hone in based on age and reading level, the right books at the right levels. And then the books are enhanced with various features to make them more accessible. So like a visual glossary and, text to speech, so you can listen to stories. So it's kind of this, we think of it as like a literacy ecosystem almost. It's bringing together the two sides of the equation, the writers and the readers, and creating this community for the ongoing generation of this new category of books.
Sure. No, I think that's great. But, and this might be kind of a stupid question, but how does a writer write for kind of certain age or kind of grade levels?
Yeah, you mean like the reading level part or the actual interest level part?
Like if I'm...
I guess both.
Well, kind of both, I guess. Like they're probably not one and the same, but how, like if I'm a writer and I'm writing a story and I say, you know what, I want to write something that's interesting for, you know, teens that are reading at, say, like at some sort of elementary school level, how do I... Like, is there kind of like guidelines or standards? Because what I'm trying to get at is if there's any kind of writers out there listening, like how do they even kind of get into this space?
Yeah, so it's a great question. It is, the approach that I've taken in kind of crafting the guidelines is to try and keep it as simple as possible, because I think a lot of the stuff you think about reading level and interest level, and it can start to get kind of confusing and daunting, but at its very core, the way I frame it is, first, interest level is how old is the intended audience? So am I writing for middle school students? Am I writing for high school students? Author, we want all of the above. So the author themselves has to decide, who am I writing for?
Okay.
And then based on that, one of the very key and simple components is the characters in your book and the things that they deal with, and the drama of their everyday life has to be high school.
Sure.
Has to be high school based if they're high school students. And the real problem that we're addressing is that right now those high school students have to read about second graders dealing with what they brought to, for lunch.
Sure.
So we give guidance around like topics that are relevant to high school students, all of that. We're really interested in developing a diverse body of literature, so trying to have, minority characters in non-stereotypical ways, et cetera. So that's the interest level piece. Relevance is kind of my key, word for it. On the reading level side, that's where people can feel even more overwhelmed, or writers are not typically thinking about reading level when they're writing a regular book. But it's actually about keeping language simple and concise and straight to the point. So little things like don't, make really long sentences with multiple clauses.
Okay.
Divide them with periods instead. Shorter chapters, shorter overall book. The vocabulary is really key. So kind of more accessible words. And combining all of those key principles, which on some levels are good writing, right? Clarity,
Sure.
results in the books being significantly lower reading levels. Avoiding idioms is another example. Things that can kind of trip you up when you're reading.
Sure. No, that makes sense. And I guess the thing that's interesting to me about kind of what you're doing, and I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, if you're even like a really good reader, I think sometimes you want to read something that maybe isn't really technically challenging from a written perspective, just because, I don't know, like I think, and tell me if I'm wrong, is like I like watching sometimes like mindless TV shows that are just like mindless comedies because I don't want something as complicated as, say, like Game of Thrones, where I need to really pay attention so I understand what's happening, where if you have something that's kind of a bit like mindless comedy, you could be on your phone or the computer and kind of it's in the background. And I don't mean that when I like I'm not trying to make it sound like, oh, like you're not paying attention when you're reading, but sometimes you just want something that you're not like constantly having to think through like almost every sentence, like some of the more complicated books, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, I mean, it's even like the example you gave with TV shows. It's like there are different purposes for TV shows.
Sure.
Sometimes you're in the mood for light and mindless, and sometimes you want something kind of heavier and more of a thought-provoking. And same with language. One of the purposes of language is to be beautiful and use, metaphor and all of that. But for the students we're serving, that's not the right purpose. It has to be more kind of easier to grasp. So to what you're saying, I absolutely agree. I think, in this case, it's like, yes, you have to let go some of the flowery language or the kind of beauty of language for language's sake for these books and focus more on easy to comprehend, kind of more graspable.
Sure. No, I think that's...
Yeah.
Okay. No, that makes sense. So, go ahead. Sorry.
One more thought to add about that is
Sure.
I think the readers that we're serving, a lot of times, especially like take a high school student, for example, if you're really reading far below grade level as a high schooler, you probably have also developed a kind of bizarre relationship with reading in general. You probably do not love it, right? You haven't read a book that really hooked you in a while. You probably are somewhat embarrassed by, maybe your skills being behind. And so a big part of our approach has to do with trying to sort of start to strip away the negative associations with reading and really engage the students so that they can start, feeling like, oh, actually reading is something I can do that's enjoyable, and that ultimately results in more reading, which then improves your reading skills. So the kind of engagement piece is a key component of our approach, is kind of giving them a positive, happy reading experience.
No, I think that's really important. And I remember even just being in kind of, elementary school and like and I don't know if they still do this, and you can maybe tell me if they do or not, but like people had to read out loud maybe like a couple pages or something to the whole class. And I can imagine if you're not a strong reader, or even if you are a strong reader, just being like, because it's basically your first introduction to public speaking. I get your reading, but right? Like just reading out loud
Yep.
can be kind of daunting in itself. And then if you're kind of
Totally.
not a strong reader, it's got to be kind of not the greatest experience, right? Do they even
Right.
still do
Yeah.
that in classrooms these days?
They still do in some classrooms. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, absolutely. I think, it's the kind of thing that as a teacher, if you're sort of in tune to your students' psychological needs also, then ideally you don't. But I know
Sure.
it's like so many students have been traumatized by that kind of experience, right? You have to get up there and show everyone that you're struggling.
Sure. Yeah, and that can be
Yeah.
kind of terrifying. The other thing
Yeah, and on the same sorry.
No, go ahead.
The same embarrassment framework actually applies to the kind of book. So, back to my 12-year-old who's reading at a first grade level, the books written for first graders, they look like baby books, right? And so she didn't want to be caught practicing reading on one of those books. That was embarrassing to her. And I felt I totally got that. And so one of the things we do with Story Shares is these are shorter books. They do use language that's more simple, but they look like teen books. They look kind of cool and catchy. And so that takes away some of the stigma that students feel if they have to read kind of lower level books.
Sure. Well, and you guys also do adaptations of kind of like books. Like I think the best example, just even looking at your homepage, is kind of Mice and Men. So walk me through kind of that. Is it basically some other author takes that book, rewrites it, the same kind of story, simpler for a certain grade level? Is that a good way of describing that?
Yeah, pretty much. And it's interesting you bring that up because those adaptations we have are actually created by teachers who, like of Mice and Men, for example, had to, teach of Mice and Men as part of the standards to high school students. But it was too hard for them, or for some of them. And so and apparently this is actually really common, she rewrote her own versions to capture kind of the essence and themes and all of that, but at a simpler level. So teachers, turns out, level books themselves to enable their students to access them better. And a lot of teachers enter our contests too. So,
Sure.
Yeah, we haven't really emphasized that element because there's still some nuance to adaptations and previously existing content that we have to wrap our minds around. But the idea of having one book at many different levels is really appealing more broadly because we have lots of different students in our classes.
Sure, and especially, I'm assuming. So again, kind of tell me if I'm wrong. But if you come, to kind of America or North America or wherever, and English isn't necessarily your first language, and you're learning the language, plus you're in kind of say high school, you might want something that's a little bit less daunting to read because you need to do a book report on or something, right? And just having a simpler version, even if like English isn't your first language, if they don't make a version in your kind of first language. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. English language learners and, new immigrants to the country are a huge part of the reader base that we serve because of that. Exactly. You are able to totally grasp high level concepts, but your language abilities are further behind. So having versions of mature content that's written at more accessible, graspable levels is really important for English language learners.
So I think you kind of mentioned it throughout the show so far with kind of the contest, but I really want to kind of give that a little bit more time. And so what exactly is it, and kind of what can people kind of submit for? Yeah,
so the contest is a fun part of our model because it brings together, this community of whether it's writers or teachers who can create a new kind of book. So we actually have postponed this current one for various reasons, but we're having it as an annual contest. So once a year, we give these same guidelines, and then the writers, and then we give prizes, cash prizes, to, I think right now our standard is doing 5 categories. Our grand prize is always diverse literature, because that's one of the big pushes. And then we have 4 other ones that we create as categories based on what we identify to be gaps in our library. So, we don't have enough, horror stories or sports-related stories. And so then we might make that a contest category to try and generate more of those. So we offer prizes to all of those categories, and then we do a big awareness campaign around it. We reach out to writers in all the different ways we can think of, and writers have a finite amount of time to create, and then they can actually kind of design their books and then submit them to the contest, and that's when we then start honing in on which ones really meet the needs of our library. When the writers submit their stories, they agree to share their stories with us from then on for our library, even if they don't win.
Okay.
So that's kind of our best way to build the collection. People can actually submit stories all year round, even when there's no contest, but there's just not the same incentive piece there.
So do you guys pay for the content, or is it donated, or how does that kind of work?
Yeah, so we pay just the winners, and the rest is kind of donated with the framework of there's a potential to win, right? So then that would be your compensation, but otherwise they just provide it. And what's really cool about this that we've learned along the way is writers are inherently interested in literacy. They love writing and reading, and they're bought into the importance of literacy. A lot of people have no idea about this problem and the huge number of teens and adults in our country who read below grade level. So when we just kind of frame it up for the writers, like, hey, there's this huge audience of readers, they need a new kind of book. If you follow some relatively simple guidelines, you can create this book for them and contribute it to this growing collection. So writers are really, actually, a lot of them are just inherently motivated to do so. So we've been really, pleased by the giving spirit of the writers as we've built this collection.
No, I think that's awesome. And you touched on something that I actually was going to ask you kind of coming up. But how, you mentioned obviously that there's a huge number of people. Do you kind of have some stats on that? Like, how big of a problem is it really? And I don't really care about the political kind of views of it, but like just kind of based on what you've seen, how big of a problem is it kind of really?
Yeah, so the numbers are startling as far as I'm concerned. They say, there's different estimates, but they say it's like 90 million teens and adults in the U.S. that lack some basic literacy skills. So that's a huge number. I think 70% of high school students in this country need some form of reading remediation. And I think I have to look at my numbers, but I think it's like 16% of African American students are proficient readers at the end of 4th grade. So that means that the rest of them are not proficient yet. And the problem with that is that after 4th grade, we're not, our education system is not focused on teaching reading anymore. We assume that you learn reading, kind of in early elementary school, and then we believe that you know how to read, and then you use reading to learn going forward. So in science and social studies in high school, you have to read in order to answer the questions. And so that's why we're focused on kind of the 4th grade plus category, because those students have fewer opportunities to then catch up. So yeah, it's a wide scale problem. And part of that is because the reason why someone might struggle with reading is varied. So it might be English language learners, it might be students who have reading disabilities like dyslexia, and then also just a huge percentage of students who are living in low income communities who maybe weren't exposed to reading early on, who maybe didn't have the best early reading instruction at school, are also reading far below grade level.
I see. Yeah, no, that's interesting. So I don't know kind of how this ties in necessarily, but I'm curious about, what about audio books where they kind of get read to you? Like, does that help you in kind of actually reading, or are they totally unrelated from each other?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the short answer is it does help actually with reading. And, I'd say there's some controversy around it. Maybe some people would not, or certain parents would say like, no, I don't want my kid to, listen to the book instead of read it. It can't be a complete replacement because obviously the skills are different, but it's an important tool because reading is making meaning from text, right? And so if you're reading something, you are comprehending it using all sorts of kind of implicit skills and strategies. If you listen to the text, you're doing that also. You're just taking away the decoding part, the actual blending together of letters and words. So giving students the opportunity to listen to text and really make meaning through listening is a way to then kind of bridge towards merging that skill with the decoding skill and have them become better at reading.
Gotcha.
Especially if they can listen while they're reading. So on our website, you can use text to speech, which is basically like a way to make it into an audiobook, and it'll highlight the words as it reads them to you. So that way you can kind of make the connection in real time also.
Got you. Yeah, and then I guess, too, it also helps just with being able to use certain words in kind of sentences and context when you're kind of talking to people, right? Yeah.
So it's like listening comprehension and reading comprehension are so closely linked.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. So I'm a little bit curious, though. We're kind of coming to the end of the show, and I really want to make sure that we cover all the kind of features that, you guys kind of provide to people. Obviously, people can go to the website and kind of read the book. You have a link to kind of, buy the actual book. You can have it listen, or people can listen to the book. But, like, is there any other features that I kind of forgot to, or we've kind of forgot to cover in this that you'd like to kind of mention?
Yeah, I would say from the kind of teacher angle, we have one of our frameworks for how we get this out there is that a lot of times these students aren't necessarily looking for books themselves, so the teachers are a good channel for really getting books to students. And so we have things like a teacher dashboard where teachers can build a class and they can recommend books to different students within that dashboard and see how they're progressing. We're actually building out some kind of supplemental teacher plans, lesson plans, and assessments to go with some of the books so that teachers can kind of use them without having to do a lot of work themselves. And then one of my favorite things, which I have not mentioned yet, is this writing tool, this book publishing tool that we created for the contest and for authors to create their books. We learned through some of our early pilot studies that was actually a really compelling feature for the students.
Nice.
Because they could create their own books and design them and then actually publish them to our student writing section, which we call for teens by teens, and become, published authors themselves. And
that's
so
huge,
it's a way to
actually.
really deepen. Yeah, it really hooks them in.
From even a confidence thing, right?
Yeah. Exactly. So we encourage it, with the schools where we're working, students can read a book and then they could write their own prequel or their own sequel, or they could write an adaptation that takes place in a different country or whatever it is. And that's, it's also a way for teachers to get a sense of how well they comprehended the story.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Is there anything else? 'Cause we're getting kind of close to the end that you kind of want to mention.
I think those are really the main pieces. I think the core of what we're providing is this library with the ability to filter books so that you can really specifically hone in on the ones that are right for you, both age and interest wise. We are still young and evolving. So soon, I imagine there will be many other elements, but those are the key ones for now.
Perfect. So I think one last thing is you guys have won a bunch of awards. Do you kind of want to maybe give us a quick overview of the awards that you guys have won?
Yeah, we've been really excited and honored to have been recognized in the field so far. So we won Teach for America's Social Innovation Award recently,
Wow,
and
congrats.
we
That's
were
awesome.
also Thank you. Yeah, thank you. We were recognized by Forbes and also the International Literacy Association, and then most recently we just were selected as an honoree in literacy by the Library of Congress.
Wow, those are huge, actually. That's really great for you guys.
Yeah, thank you. It's a good way to really kind of get it out there more broadly as well.
Sure. Well, let's close the show then with mentioning again where people can find you guys online and any other kind of social media links you want to mention.
Yes, so it's storyshares.org. There's an S at the end, and then on that's our handle on Instagram and Twitter. It's just at StoryShares, Facebook as well. And those are kind of the key places you can find us.
Perfect. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to be on the show, and I look forward to keeping in touch with you, and have a good rest of your day.
Great. Thank you so much.
Perfect.
Nice
Thanks.
to talk to you.
Okay. Bye.
Okay. Bye.
Thanks for listening. Please visit the show's website at buildingthefutureshow.com. Also check us out on Facebook at Building the Future Show and follow us on Twitter at Building Show. The music for the show is done by Electric Mantra. You can check him out at electricmantra.com and keep building the future.